So I'm Ryan. I'm going to talk today about a new kind of denial of service attack that we conceived, prototyped, and implemented a bit at UC Berkeley. And this is joint work with 3 great collaborators there, Mukul Murthy, Nick Weaver, and Vern Paxson. Okay, so to start out here, this is going to be an attack paper. And what we're going to try to do here is come up with a new kind of flooding-based denial of service attack. And the question that you're probably asking is, okay, well, this is old. You know, we already have DDoS. We already have amplification, right? Is there really anything new kind of in this space, right, that's somewhat practical? And so what we're going to try to say is, yes, there is. We can actually, using something called temporal lensing, which we develop here, we can take a low bandwidth flood from an attacker and change the packet arrival times at the victim so that this low flood turns into a short but large pulse. And this kind of pulsing this kind of pulsing attack, the actual pulses itself, have been explored in previous works, and they can target TCP's retransmit timeout and additive increase multiplicative decrease mechanisms, as have been explored in true and pulsing papers, right? But the novelty here is that we're able to use the entire attacker bandwidth and kind of funnel it up into a short pulse, right? And so the question is, how are we going to do this? And so for inspiration, we're going to go back to World War II, right? And in World War II, there was this kind of, this problem for the Allies where they had limited artillery, limited shelling capacity, and they really wanted to kind of do the most impact for the ammunition that they had. And so what they did is they came up with this technique called time on target, where multiple artillery would coordinate their sending times so that all of their attack traffic landed on the victim in a short burst. And a newer and more advanced kind of technique that borrows from time on target is multiple round simultaneous impact. And this is where a single artillery, by varying the trajectory and the charge of its firing, can fire multiple rounds and have all these rounds rendezvous on the victim in one burst. Right, so for our actual attack, our goal here is to take the top graph and somehow use a network and get that bottom graph at the victim, right? So we're going to send at a low overall rate and get a pulse of the victim. And we're going to do this, this attack here is kind of like, so we call it lensing because we're going to concentrate traffic and focus it like a lens focuses light. And this attack is going to be orthogonal to, but also compatible with amplification. And so to actually leverage it, right, we need multiple latencies and paths for an attacker to send to, right? And so we're going to do that by using reflectors, right? And so this is a very contrived example of how this might work. So what we have here are essentially 3 reflectors in the network, and each one gives the victim a different attack path latency, essentially a different path time through the reflector to the victim, right? So R1, R2, and R3 have path times of 3, 2, and 1 second respectively, right? So if the attacker only sends at a rate of 1 packet per second, right? So to start this off, right, that at time 0, the attacker will send to R1, right? And since the path time here is 3 seconds, this packet will arrive at time 3. And so this packet travels through the network, and at time 1, the attacker will send towards R2. And since this path time is 2 seconds, right, this packet will also rendezvous at the victim at time 3, right? And then at time 2, we do the same thing with the 3rd reflector, and that also will rendezvous at time 3 of the victim. So what we've done here is we've sent at a rate of only 1 packet per second, but we see that at the victim, we're able to concentrate this traffic into a short pulse of 3 packets per second. And so now the question is, now that we can, we have this theoretical intuition of how this works, how can we actually conduct a lensing attack, right? And there's 2 main steps. The first is obtaining these path time or attack path latency estimates, which is essentially the time through a reflector to the victim, and doing this on the internet, right? And the second question is, given these estimates, how do we optimize the size of the pulse, right? How can we make that pulse, I guess, as tall as possible? And for our prototype, we're going to limit it to DNS in the sense that, so first of all, what that will let us do is we can use DNS recursion to enable reflection instead of having to use source IP spoofing. And it also lets us get better latency estimations, as we'll show in the next slide. Okay, so the first problem here is, how do we estimate, these attack path latencies? How can we find the latency through a reflector to the victim? And so what we're going to do is we're going to leverage something called King, which is a prior work used to essentially measure latencies between arbitrary end hosts in the network. And so if we take King and overlay it with the actors in our attack here in red, right, we get a very nice one-to-one mapping. And essentially the way that we can make these measurements, right, so the reflector will be an open DNS server, and the victim will be a DNS name server, here authoritative for the domain foo.bar, right? And so the attacker, essentially what he does is, step one is send a request for a subdomain of foo.bar, here XYZ. The resolver gets this request, and it doesn't know the answer, so it forwards it to the authoritative server for foo.bar, which is the victim. The victim knows the answer, gives a reply back, and the reflector, which is an open DNS resolver, forwards that reply back to the attacker, right? And so by taking the time difference between when the first query was sent and when the last response was received, the attacker now has an estimate for this attack path round trip time, and can have that to get an estimate for the attack path latency. Right, so now with these attack path, estimates, there's a question of how does an attacker build an optimal schedule in the sense that of making the largest pulse possible. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to choose a target pulse window, which is the duration and offset of when we want the actual spike to land at the victim. And then we ask the question, so now for each slot that the sender has, or the attacker has to send, which reflector should the attacker choose? And it turns out that the greedy answer is the right answer. Essentially choose the reflector that if we send at this given time, it'll have the highest probability of bouncing that packet into the pulse window. And so this is greedy, but we show in the paper that it is in fact optimal. Right, so for our actual prototype setup, what we've done here is on the West Coast, we have an Azure VM, and on the East Coast, an Amazon and Azure VM that will act as our victims. Our reflectors are open DNS resolvers that we obtained from an open list online, and they are not under our control, right? And the thing to note here is we're going to DOS our own servers that are under our control, and we're also going to throttle load to any of these reflectors. So we're not going to do any harm, I guess, in our experiments. So before we actually get to the results, we want to ask the question, how can we really determine how effective lensing is? And so we came up with two metrics here. The first is the bandwidth gain. And it really asks the question of how much bang can an attacker get for his buck, right? So, and we determine this by taking the bandwidth of the pulse that an attacker creates to the attacker's own upload bandwidth. And so, for example, attacker would want a higher bandwidth gain. The second is a concentration efficiency, which is somewhat similar. And it's essentially a measure of the proportion of packets that an attacker sends that actually land in the pulse and will actually be effective for the attack. So these measures might seem duals of one another, but actually they are a little bit different. And to illustrate that, for example, if an attacker sent only one packet and it landed in the window, the gain would be the smallest possible gain possible, 1x, but it would have an efficiency of 100% because every packet the attacker sent landed in the window. Okay, so to illustrate this with an actual example here. So this is an actual pulse that we did targeting the Amazon victim, right? And so the first thing to note here is, right, the bottom graph, what you see is this is the sending traffic from the attacker, And on the bottom, what we have is the arrival packets of the victim. And so you notice here that we can actually create this pulsing. We can actually use lensing to create pulses, right? And so the quick eyeball way to kind of calculate these metrics, right? The bandwidth gain can simply be calculated by taking the height of the pulse bucket and dividing that by the tallest height of the sending buckets on the top. And the efficiency is simply the area of the pulse bucket divided by the sum of the area of the attacker buckets in the top graph. Right, so now that we know we can actually create these pulses, we want to measure kind of how do these pulses change as a factor of kind of two big things. The first is the attacker bandwidth. So as we emulate attackers with different upload bandwidths, can we still create this lensing effect, or does it scale poorly? The second question is, how narrow or wide can we create these pulses? And so to answer the first question, what we did is essentially took our two metrics, which are on the y-axis, and we measured them against the attacker maximum bandwidth. So we artificially throttled the bandwidth that the attacker would send at. And so what we see is for low to medium bandwidths, it seems to scale well, right? We have a relatively constant efficiency and a constant bandwidth gain. But we see that at attacker bandwidths of 10,000 packets per second and higher, we see this drop-off. And the question is this drop-off a result of poor scaling, or is it perhaps maybe the attack actually working and overwhelming the victim? So what we did was we measured the actual download capacity of the site by flooding it with an actual flood. And we saw that it could only take a maximum of 60,000 packets per second. And then what we did is we measured the actual peak bandwidth of the pulse. So not the relative bandwidth gain, but the actual, how big can we make these pulses? And that's what's on the y-axis here. And what we see is that it also levels out at around 60,000 packets per second. So really, this kind of poor scaling at attacker bandwidths of 10 plus thousand packets per second, that's not really poor scaling at all. What it is just we're overwhelming the victim, and the metrics fall off because of that. Okay, so now, right, so now satisfied with kind of our prototype, we move on to kind of a few extensions of how to make the attack practical, fully operational, and perhaps how to make it better. And so the first extension might be, it's a real biggie. How can we attack non-DNS hosts, right? So if you remember in our prototype, what we had was essentially we limited the victim to an authoritative DNS name server. And so, but for a real attacker, we'll want to target any kind of host. And so there's a few tricks that we can play to do that. We can manipulate DNS records to make the victim appear as an authoritative DNS server. We can also find DNS servers located close to the victim, take latency measurements to that host, and then for the actual attack, target the victim. The next extension would be to combine lensing with amplification. And this could be potentially troublesome for a victim, right? Because an amplification factor, say of 15, and bandwidth gain of 10, this would let an attacker create pulses that would be 150 times greater than his own upload bandwidth. There's also the question, can we distribute attacks in the sense of, can we have multiple attackers each create lensing and have all of their pulses add up at the victim? And so what we found is because this actually requires coordination of time synchronization between the attackers, and that what we used was NTP, and it was not fine-grained enough to create small pulses. So we had to essentially make the window size a little bit bigger than usual to accommodate this kind of time skew between attackers. There's also the question of, somehow increasing the bandwidth gain, right? And so there are various ways that we explore in the paper of perhaps ways to increase the attack path latency, right? Perhaps, find longer paths on the internet, essentially providing more time for an attacker to funnel up his bandwidth into the pulse. There's also like a cool thing that we noted essentially with retransmits. And so here essentially what happens is because the reflectors are DNS resolvers, and at higher bandwidths, essentially what happens is the victim cannot keep up. And so the victim is an authoritative DNS server, and it can't keep up with the queries that the resolvers query at. And so some of the queries are actually dropped. And so some of the resolvers will time out and then resend. And that's what you see in the bottom graph, these auxiliary spikes, right? It's the resolvers will time out and then resend. And because their timeouts are usually kind of like, like here it's like 0.8 and 2 seconds. You'll see these spikes at 0.8 and 2 seconds after the original pulse. So I guess onto defenses here. So there's two main sides to defense. The first is defending against the reconnaissance portion, the King-style latency estimations, right? And so a defender might be able to stop or poison these estimations, but even if the defender did, there's still no story for an attacker finding a co-located server to the victim and obtaining measurements to it. So for defending against the actual attack, so for the shrew and pulsing side, essentially there's been prior work on strengthening TCP, either through randomizing the RTO value, increasing buffer sizes, things like that. Our contribution here was perhaps routers could add an artificial amount of jitter to packets as they're sent, and this would essentially spread out the pulse that's created through lensing. And that's obviously a no-go for regular traffic, but we do note that multipathing actually has a very similar property here, where it's almost as if we're adding artificial jitter if the attack traffic takes these different paths. Okay, and then to move a little faster here. So to conclude, we've introduced temporal lensing. It's a new class of denial service attack, and it uses reflectors not to amplify per se, but to concentrate a flood. Very similar to how a lens focuses light. And by itself, it can get an order of magnitude bandwidth gain, and if combined with amplification, perhaps even more. And so thanks everyone for your time, and I'll take any questions.
Frank Staiano, University of Cambridge. When you said you needed to lengthen the window when you are doing distributed attack, couldn't the distributed attackers synchronize with something like GPS?
Sorry, could you repeat that last part?
Could the distributed attackers not synchronize themselves more accurately than NTP by using GPS time?
Yeah, so that's probably definitely possible. We just tried NTP, but yes, if they had some more fine-grained synchronization, they could definitely probably do better than we did. It was just for our prototype. We use NTP, which is just not fine-grained enough. Yeah.
And the other question was, maybe I didn't quite understand everything, but when you get a flash like this, how permanent is the damage that it causes?
Right. So one single pulse will probably not do that much damage. If done right, it can perhaps trigger a retransmit timeout. And so the idea would be to not just send one pulse, but to send multiple pulses on some fixed period. And so this is actually explored more in the shrew and pulsing papers, right, of exactly how to send these pulses to degrade TCP as much as possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Christian Russell, Saarland University. I'm wondering how much these attacks actually scale higher to rates that you've shown, because the rates that you've shown are actually just very small rates, like a couple of 100,000 packets per second. Especially, I'm wondering about the buffers that may fill up at the reflector side when they receive multiple of your requests.
Right.
So that then the RTT essentially is screwed up because the buffers are filled up and it takes like a random number of milliseconds to compute them.
Yeah, so that's a valid point, but I think because there's just so many reflectors out there, right? Like there's been measurements that there's been like, I don't know, like millions of reflectors. Filling up any one given reflector's buffer shouldn't be a problem if you distribute this attack to multiple reflectors. Yeah.
The other question, the other question I had was regarding a graphs. Maybe that's just a matter of visualization, but in all the graphs you've shown that actually the spike was before the attacker sent out the packets. How could that be?
Yeah. So the time for the two graphs was not actually synchronized.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it was just arbitrary time. Yeah.
I'm Mohammed Ta from the University of Illinois, Chicago. I was like kind of concerned that how would your attack model work if there was some kind of scheduler or load balancer and the victim was within an internal network?
So are you asking like if there's some kind of buffering that happens at the victim?
I mean, if the victim is internal network and there's some kind of middle box or proxy line between it that's scheduling packets, so.
Yeah, so I'm unclear on how that would change things. Are you saying it would make it harder for an attacker?
Could you comment on that? I mean.
So if there's elements in the way, right? So I mean, okay. So like if there are like elements of the network in the way, the thing is that the King-style latency estimations will take that into account, right? And so what we did is we essentially sent our attack traffic using the same conduit that we obtained the latency measurements on. So I don't see how anything in the middle would affect that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we should probably move on to the next speaker. Let's thank the speaker again.